Scott Pilgrim is a series about how we're all kind of not great people in our early 20s. It's a story about how we're all broken in our own ways, how we've more than likely done harm to those we surround ourselves with, as well as those we no longer surround ourselves with. Sure, the antagonists in this story are undeniably cruel to the protagonists at some point, but it's an important detail that many of them do have legitimate cause for anger towards them, and the story does its best to never absolve the main characters of their sins against other people. A critical aspect of Scott Pilgrim is that it's a story about trying to change that about yourself as you get older, and the importance of making amends with who you were before you can move forward into who you're going to be. But instead of tackling the complex view of morality that the story provides, I'm going to rank the members of the League of Evil Exes based on how evil I think they actually are. Why? I thought it would make for a fun video. I'm mostly going to be talking about the story beats from the graphic novels, but I will be touching on the anime too when it's relevant. I'm going to be ranking the Exes from the most evil to the least, because I think most people will agree about who the most evil of the Evil Exes is, and I think that the actually controversial picks are closer to the end. So with that in mind, who is Ramona Flower's most evil? Gideon. It's Gideon Graves. Of course, it's Gideon. While Scott Pilgrim Takes Off does give Gideon a bit more depth of character and somewhat changes his backstory, they never really try to present Gideon as someone who isn't a bad person. He founded the League of Evil Exes to try and force Ramona to come back to him. He fully plans to kill Scott when he thinks Ramona and him are still together, and once he finds out they aren't, he immediately tries to convince Scott to join the League to get revenge on Ramona, the same way he convinced all the others. And by the end of the story, it turns out that, unlike all the other members of the League, Ramona isn't even his full interest. Ramona is only the most recent in a string of ex-girlfriends that Gideon is obsessed with forcing to make love him. She's the final girl he plans to capture and cryogenically store until he can find a way to make them want to go out with him. Even that doesn't cover everything he's done, like creating the glow as a form of psychological warfare, or him altering Scott's memories of high school, or trying to blow up a theater just for some petty revenge. Gideon Graves is clearly the most evil of Ramona's exes, and it isn't close. There's a very big gap in the immorality of Gideon Graves and the immorality of the other 6 exes. But I also think there's a decently sized gap between the next 2 exes and the other 4. The second evilest Evil Ex, in my opinion, is the very first one we get introduced to, Matthew Patel. Now, granted, we don't get a lot of development from him as he's the villain for the first book, and he's not in the book for very long before Scott beats him, but the little bit of him we do get to see is not pretty. Matthew and Ramona dated in the 7th grade, more than a full decade before the story actually takes place, and according to Ramona, they only dated for about a week and a half and only kissed once. Honestly, a pretty standard middle school relationship from what I can gather, but Matthew is still hung up on it 12 years later, hungry for revenge against Ramona and her new boyfriend. Similar to Gideon, we get a more developed picture of Matthew in the anime, but where the anime gives us a better understanding of Gideon as a person, it only seems to serve to make Matthew even more evil. This version of Matthew Patel doesn't seem to want revenge on Ramona, but wants to get back together with her, and seems to think he's entitled to that outcome once he defeats Scott in their fight. When things don't turn out that way, he's furious and gathers the Evil Exes to confront Gideon and challenge him for ownership of his media empire, which he ends up using just to live out his dreams of being a star. The graphic novel's Matthew Patel is a rage-fueled but ultimately harmless clown that only serves to introduce the concept of the Evil Exes to Scott and the readers. But the anime's Matthew Patel is shown to be a dangerous man who lashes out violently when people won't give him what he feels he's entitled to. Number 3 in this ranking is the vegan bass player himself, Todd Ingram. It would be easy to pin a lot of his behaviors in his volume on his devotion to Envy Adams, as she still harbors a lot of resentment towards Scott after his and her own messy breakup, and clearly wants Todd to make him suffer as a result. And while Todd doesn't seem as concerned with revenge on Ramona, he's more than happy to punish Scott for envy. That said, his behavior seems to be more just a general enjoyment of hurting people around him, as well as an even greater sense of entitlement than Matthew does. Despite their claims that they have a long, deep love story and that they're fated to be together, Todd has no real loyalty to Envy, and is cheating on her throughout the story with one of their other band members. This isn't even the only cheating Todd does, as he's cheating on his vegan diet, ultimately leading to the loss of his powers. But this behavior in every corner of his life makes it painfully clear that Todd doesn't really have anyone or anything that he values other than himself. He feels he should be able to do whatever he wants, whenever he wants, to whoever he wants, and the world should just accommodate that selfish desire, no matter who might get hurt in the process. I do think that the X's in second and third place are pretty close together, and you could make an argument for either one being in either spot, but ultimately what seals it for me is the difference in time after the breakups. Matthew has been stewing over being dumped by Ramona for 12 years, but Todd has only been bitter for about 6 years. Probably. It's not super clear how long exactly it's been since Todd and Ramona broke up. They dated in high school, starting right after she cheated on Lucas Lee with Todd, and it's implied that they ended up going their separate ways after starting to go to separate colleges, which would be when they're roughly 18. Would Todd have gotten over his sense of entitlement and his anger towards Ramona if he had another 6 years? Probably not from what we've seen of him, but we can't definitively say that he wouldn't. People change pretty substantially over the course of their 20s, and that lack of certainty is what makes me place him just under Matthew in this ranking. The next placement on this list is a good bit behind these three, but still pretty safely above the people that come up after them on the list. Number 4, and ostensibly the middle of the road for the Evil Exes, is taken up by Kyle and Ken Katayanagi, the twins that Scott faces in Volume 5 of the graphic novel. These characters are notably pretty evil. They disrupt multiple parties in the pursuit of defeating Scott, and at the end of the volume, they actually kidnap Kim to force Scott into one final confrontation. As for the anime, they don't really do all that much directly, and never even have a resolution with Ramona like the rest of the Exes do, but their future selves do help older Scott abduct his past self to try and stop him from ever getting together with Ramona. The Katayanagi twins honestly could have stood a chance of being higher on this list, despite having to share a volume with one another and most of their fights with Scott happening in the background, if not for a few things that do make them stand out. Firstly, when Kim lies to Scott about getting a message from Ramona saying she believes in him, the twins are surprised to hear that Ramona is showing such support to one of her partners. But where many of the other exes would have thought such a change would never happen, the twins, while sitting in disbelief, seemingly accept it as the truth before Scott defeats them. Secondly, other than Gideon himself, they're Ramona's most recent exes, having been two-timed by her in her second semester of college. This breakup being relatively recent, combined with the consistent absurdity of the world the story takes place in, makes many of their actions a bit more reasonable in the grand scheme of things. Aside from the multiple kidnappings, that's definitely evil behavior that can't be excused by being cheated on. By this point, we're getting to the people on the list who aren't really evil to my mind, so much as they are just kind of jerks. Number 5, or I guess 6, depending on if you count the twins as one spot or two, is Lucas Lee, the second evil ex that Scott faces. Lucas is another ex that we don't really get a lot of time to interact with in the graphic novels, but unlike Matthew, the small snippets of Lucas that we get paint him as way less messed up over Ramona than most of the others. Don't get me wrong, Lucas does seem to hate Ramona, but it's more in the vein of someone hating an old ex that did them wrong, rather than being on the same level of needing to get revenge on her or win her back. He very briefly fights Scott, but it's clear his heart isn't really in it. He's only a part of the League of Evil Exes because of his importance to Ramona's past, and he even offers to let Scott leave and pretend to Gideon that he lost the fight. As for the anime, it seems when Ramona confronts Lucas that he doesn't seem to have any real animosity towards Ramona, which is especially interesting considering that she cheated on him to end their relationship. He's carried the hurt of how their relationship ended with him for nearly a decade, and it's shaped him into the person that he is today. But he doesn't want to make her suffer for it like the rest of the League, and that puts him well below the other members on this list. And with that, we've gotten 6 of the 7 Evil Exes out of the way. And if you've been paying attention, you should know who we have left. The last Evil Ex to talk about, Ramona's least evil ex, is Roxy Richter. Roxy is one of the more recent exes of Ramona's, being her roommate in college for a time. Roxy is visibly hurt by the way Ramona just walked out on her, but unlike every other member of the League, Roxy seems to still care about Ramona, at least on some level. Despite presumably wanting to get revenge on Ramona for the poor handling of their breakup, when Roxy thinks Scott is cheating on her with Lisa Miller, she goes and warns her about him, encouraging her to break up with him. It would be easy enough for her to just allow Ramona to be hurt by Scott's alleged cheating, but instead she goes out of her way to try and protect her from that pain. Granted, she does end up making out with Ramona at some point in the story while Ramona and Scott are still together, but every one of Ramona's exes were trying to break up her and Scott so they could get back together with her.
Listen to me, all of you. If we win, we don't get Ramona. I flawlessly defeated her precious little Scott, and she still turned me down. Gasp!
I don't think it makes Roxy especially evil that she's just the one with the closest thing to success on that front. So there you have it. Ramona's League of Evil Exes ranked from their most evil to least evil members. Similar to numbers 2 and 3, I think an argument could be made for numbers 5 and 6 being swapped depending on your view of things, so I suppose that this would be a bit more accurate of a way to visualize the rankings, but I do think I'm right with putting Matthew as more evil than Todd and Roxy as less evil than Lucas. I think that the amount of time they've each been hung up on Ramona's dumping them makes for a good marker of how reasonable their actions could be argued to be. So Matthew's actions are going to be the most unreasonable out of all the exes, since he and Ramona were together for such a short period of time so long ago. Even more important than the length of the grudge is how the exes act because of the grudge. So someone like Lucas just quietly being bitter over Ramona's cheating, or Roxy even going out of her way to try and help Ramona with what she perceives as a bad boyfriend, are absolutely going to push them toward the less evil end of the list. If any of you think I'm wrong and have your own opinions on how these 7 should be ordered, I'd love to hear about it. Leave me a comment telling me your opinions on the exes. I read everything you guys put down there. While you're at it, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Maybe check out one of the other video essays too, like this one. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.